Section 3 of Abraham Lincoln the Practical Mystic by Francis Grierson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
A prophetic witness. In his book, Life on the Circuit with Lincoln, Judge Whitney comments, "As early as 1856, independent of all contemporary opinion, I conceived the idea that Mr. Lincoln was a prodigy of intellectual and moral force. Others associated with us deemed him superlatively great, but still human. I went farther. My view was definite and pronounced, that Lincoln was ordained for a greater than a merely human mission, and I avowed this belief as early as that time. His character as a lawyer was controlled and molded by his character as a man. He understood human nature thoroughly and was an expert in the cross-examination of witnesses. If a witness told the truth without evasion, Lincoln was respectful and patronizing to him. But he would score a perjured witness unmercifully. He took no notes, but remembered everything quite as well as those who did so. I remember once we all, court and lawyers, except Lincoln, insisted that a witness had sworn so-and-so. But it turned out that Lincoln was correct and that he recollected better than the united bench and bar. But with all his candor, there was a method and shrewdness which Leonard Swett well understood, and which he had thus forcibly expressed. As the trial progressed, where most lawyers object, he would say he reckoned it would be fair to admit this sin or that, and sometimes, when his adversary could not quite prove what Lincoln knew to be the truth, he would say he reckoned it would be fair to admit the truth to be so-and-so. When he did object to the court, when he heard his objections answered, he would often say, "Well, I reckon I must be wrong." He was wise as a serpent in the trial of a case, but I have got too many scars from his blows to certify that he was harmless as a dove. When the whole thing is unravelled, the adversary begins to see that what he was so blandly giving away was simply what he couldn't get and keep. By giving away 6 points and carrying the 7th, he carried his case, and the whole case hanging on the 7th, he traded everything which would give him the least aid in carrying that. Anyone who took Lincoln for a simple-minded man would very soon wake up on his back in a ditch. Lincoln's simplicity. There are two kinds of simplicity. One is without reason or discrimination, that believes all that is seen and heard if presented under the guise of honesty. The other is the kind that penetrates beneath manner, dress, verbiage, and meets all subterfuge, artifice, and sophistry with statements and facts at once logical and irrefutable. Lincoln was the most simple man in dress, in speech, in manners, in looks, that ever stood before the world in so great a role. But his intellect was anything but simple. He was never deceived by cunning devices and cunning manoeuvres. Bacon has an essay showing the difference between cunning and wisdom, and it may be said that Lincoln's knowledge took the form of wisdom as distinguished from cunning. His management of a law case was that of a seer. The points he made were not made for personal gratification, but for love of truth and justice. Not only he did not want to risk being deceived, he took every precaution to ensure against deception. Here is where his welding of reason and logic produced in his marvelous intellect a kind of clairvoyance which his friends at the bar felt but could not analyze. The combination was unheard of. The lawyers and the judges could only reason from their own experience. They could only cite examples in their own lives. And this man Lincoln was unlike all that had been and all that was. Lincoln's simplicity seemed to the casual observer of a character so trusting and so naive that it deceived all the members of his cabinet during the first 2 years of the war. They were used to smart men, clever men, academical men. They called for the routine of respectability and official dignity. To their minds the president seemed pliable and willing, and they set about instructing him in the ABC of high politics and the first principles of statesmanship. The president was in no way frustrated. He understood them in advance, having weighed them in the balance of his own judgment. He had found them honest but inexperienced, sincere but saucy. He knew they were living in an atmosphere of low visibility. At the proper moment he would turn on the searchlights and give them their bearings. Some of them expected to act as the president's pilot, while others expected to be captain of the ship of state with the president as pilot. It took them more than 2 years to find out that this pioneer of the West was captain, pilot, and master of charts on a political sea the like of which they little dreamed existed. In one sense, he wore out their obstinacy by his patience. In another, he awaited opportunities to attest their errors and show his judgment. But matters proceeded with such calm that they could not understand with what power he acted, with what prescience he divined. What mystified them was the combination of the practical with the spiritual, their clear vision with the maxims of ordinary business affairs, the penetration of the future while working in seeming darkness. Lincoln's clairvoyant wit. Lincoln was not deceived by an outward show of religion. A Southern woman begged the president to have her husband released from a Northern prison. For, she said, although he is a rebel, he is a very religious man. Lincoln replied, I am glad to hear that, because any man who wants to disrupt this union needs all the religion in sight to save him. He treated with indifference people who commandeered. A haughty woman came to Lincoln and demanded a colonel's commission for her son. I demand it, she said, not as a favor, but as a right. Sir, my grandfather fought at Lexington, my father fought at New Orleans, and my husband was killed at Monterey. I guess, madam, was Lincoln's reply,
your family has done enough for the country.
It is time to give someone else a chance. When Hugh McCulloch, Secretary of the Treasury in Lincoln's second term, presented a delegation of New York bankers at the White House, McCulloch said, these gentlemen of New York have come on to see the Secretary of the Treasury about our new loan. As bankers, they are obliged to hold our national securities. I can vouch for their patriotism and loyalty, for, as the good book says, where the treasure is, there will the heart be also. To which Lincoln replied, there is another text, Mr. McCulloch, I remember, that might equally apply. Where the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. Lincoln condemned as tedious a certain Greek history. When a diplomat present said, the author of that history, Mr. President, is one of the profoundest scholars of the age, no one has plunged more deeply into the sacred fount of learning. Yes, replied Lincoln, or come up drier. When in Chicago in 1860, the mayor, John Wentworth, asked Lincoln why he did not get some astute politician to run him. Lincoln replied that events and not a man's own exertions made presidents. To Henry C. Whitney, Lincoln remarked, Judd and Ray and those fellows think I don't see anything, but I see all around them. I see better what they want to do with me than they do themselves. They were deceived not by Lincoln, who never cared what individuals thought, but by nature, which often sets a trap for people who live in a world of their own illusions. Nature, the medium through which the divine mind manifests, is, so to speak, a mask through which egoists cannot penetrate and by which the cunning are led to destruction. Lincoln let them talk and even act, knowing that they themselves were the tools for their own undoing. While the ward politicians and others who thought themselves far superior laid their plans, schemed and intrigued, the man of clear vision awaited unperturbed the events which he knew would put them all in their proper places. Little did they dream that they were mere incidents among the millions of incidents
that go to the making of one epoch-making event.
The practical mystic is little concerned with incidents. The multitude do not know in what direction they are going, moved and influenced as they are by the incidental, the accidental, the shifting illusions in which they live. But the man who knows why they are influenced also knows why he is influenced. Lincoln was patient with the men who considered him a sort of political accident. He understood their point of view. He did not entertain feelings of revenge. Hundreds of men, like John Wentworth, are only mentioned today because of some passing incident which connected them with the man whom they regarded as a failure in politics. A prophetic vision of Hades. That William Blake was a mystic of the practical kind, there can be no question. In art and in poetry, he had that illumination which Lincoln had in statesmanship. The New York Times says that a century has failed to heap the dust of oblivion over England's greatest mystic, William Blake, is exemplified by the reproduction in a recent issue of Country Life of one of Blake's engravings for Dante's Inferno, in which 4 fiends with cruel faces are torturing a soul in hell. The face of the chief devil, who is not actually engaged in the torture but is an eager and interested spectator, might easily be taken for a portrait of the German emperor. As suggested by W.F. Boudillon, the familiar upturned mustachios must have puzzled Blake in his vision. He represented them as tusks growing from the corners of the mouth. It is to be noted that this fiend alone among the four has the tusks. It is recorded of Blake as a lad that his father would have apprenticed him to Rylance, the court engraver, a man much liked and in great prosperity at the time, but Blake objected, saying, "Father, I do not like his face. He looks as if he would live to be hanged." 12 years later, Rylance committed forgery and the prophecy came true. Blake's visions, startling though they be, are not more startling than the prophecies made by Lincoln, as for instance his prophecy of prohibition, women's rights, and the end of slavery, not to mention his visions concerning himself. The practical mystic sees through, the scientific materialist sees only the surface. Eternity is the everlasting now. Blake drew a faithful portrait of the Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany long before the Kaiser was born, and Tycho Brahe predicted the birth of a Swedish conqueror and what he would accomplish. In these things there is no place for chance. Nor is it true that the practical mystic is limited to poetry or art, or to music, or to religion, politics, and philosophy. Neither is the practical mystic confined to any particular social class or any creed. Abraham Lincoln could not have directed affairs had he been a recluse. Before he became an adept in the direction of material affairs, he had to be familiar with the practical ways of the world, and as a lawyer he passed through a school that left no place for vague theories or vain illusions. He frequently stripped others of their illusions, but, being free of illusions himself, he had none to lose. This made him invulnerable. His enemies were swayed by theories. Nothing short of knowledge sufficed for this man, who reduced his adversaries to the position where they were kept constantly on the alert to know what maneuver to employ next. They moved in a region of guesswork, where there was no law except that of their own confusion and discomfiture. Shakespeare and Lincoln. Lincoln, says Judge Whitney, was one of the most heterogeneous characters that ever played a part in the great drama of history, and it was for this reason that he was so greatly misjudged and misunderstood. That he was on the one hand described as a mere humorist, a sort of Artemus Ward or Mark Twain, that it was thought that by some irony of fate a low comedian had got into the presidential chair, and that the nation was being delivered over to conflagration, while this modern Nero fiddled upon its ruins. One of his peculiarities was his inequality of conduct, his dignity interspersed with freaks of frivolity and inanity, his high aspiration and achievement, and his descent into the most primitive vales of listlessness. In the chief drawer of his cabinet table, all the current joke books of the time were in juxtaposition with official commissions, lacking only the final signature, applications for pardons from death penalties, laws awaiting executive action, and orders which, when launched, would control the fate of 1,000,000 men and the destinies of unborn generations. Hence it was that superficial persons, who expected great achievements to be ushered in with a prologue, could not understand or appreciate that this great man's administration was a succession of acts of grand and heroic statesmanship, or that he was a prodigy of intellect and moral force. The mystic Shakespeare and the mystic Lincoln have a connecting link in their wit and humour. Had Shakespeare left us only 2 dramas, Macbeth and Othello, no one would have dreamed of a creation like Falstaff emanating from the same mind. Yet it is because of the union of the tragic and the humorous that Shakespeare is universally human, worldly wise as well as spiritual and metaphysical. Shakespeare makes of the gravedigger in Hamlet a sort of clown with a spade, and throughout all his dramas wit and humour, pathos and tragedy go hand in hand. Without his humour, Shakespeare would have been little more than an English Racine. With Lincoln, humour was made to serve a high psychic purpose. By its means he created a new atmosphere and new conditions through which he could all the more freely work and act. He brought humour into play for his own good as well as that of others. He was not a theorist or a dreamer of dreams. He was a practical mystic. A prophecy fulfilled. In a letter written from Springfield, Illinois, August 15, 1855, To the Honorable George Robertson of Lexington, Kentucky, Lincoln said, "The autocrat of all the Russias will proclaim his subjects free sooner than will our American masters voluntarily give up their slaves." On the day before Lincoln's first inauguration as President of the United States, the autocrat of all the Russias, Alexander II, by imperial decree emancipated his serfs, while 6 weeks after the inauguration the American masters, headed by Jefferson Davis, began the Great War of Secession to perpetuate and spread the institution of slavery. This is only one of Lincoln's prophecies which proved true. In stating them, he did not pass into an abnormal state. He spoke as one would speak of the coming weather. He did not consult the stars, nor any person, before making a prophetic statement. Seeing clearly was as natural to him as eating or sleeping. He was not a psychic machine uttering thoughts which seemed strange and enigmatical to himself, because his intellectual and spiritual powers were part of himself. Men of genius are not instruments in the vulgar meaning of the word. They do not act in ignorance of what they are doing and saying. Lincoln, more than any other, could give deliberate reasons for what he did and said, and it is exceedingly difficult to name another in history who was under such logical and commanding control of all the moral and intellectual faculties. When he seemed to the superficial observer to be dreaming, he was reasoning, calculating, comparing, analyzing, weighing,
turning things upside down and inside out, until he satisfied the dictates of his conscience and his sense of moral responsibility. He placed no reliance on halfway measures and palliatives,
no faith in the workings of chance. He therefore was not and could never have been a passive instrument in the hands of some unknown power. When it was said of a certain musician that he composed his operas under the direct influence of Mozart, the answer was, then who influenced Mozart? Great originality belongs to the mystical unity of the supreme intelligence. Had Lincoln imitated Henry Clay, whom he so much admired as a statesman and thinker, what would have become of Lincoln and the country he governed? He who originates is authoritative, and as Carlyle said, all authority is mystical in its origin. In no single thing of importance did Lincoln copy anyone's methods or systems. His trend of thought was at variance with the prevailing trend, even of those who were supposed to know the most.
End of section 3.